Watch where you're going. You black animal.
The push sent 13-year-old Tobias crashing into the airport check-in counter. His boarding pass scattered across the polished marble floor of Terminal 3 at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, joining the rolling quarters from his grandmother's carefully wrapped snack money. The sound echoed through the gate area like a judge's gavel. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. The airport hummed with the usual chaos of weekend travelers, families rushing to catch flights, business people barking into phones, and the perpetual announcements echoing from overhead speakers. Gate C-17 was particularly crowded with passengers waiting for the 6:15 p.m. flight to Atlanta. Tobias slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his hand instinctively moving to his shoulder where it had struck the counter's edge. His dark eyes remained steady, focused, showing something that should have warned Bradford. But the older boy was too busy performing for his audience. Two other teenagers from his private school who stood behind him, phones already recording. "Did you see that?" Bradford laughed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Kid can't even walk straight. Probably his first time in an airport. What Bradford didn't notice was how carefully Tobias gathered his belongings. Not frantically, not with the shame or fear most 13-year-olds would show after being publicly humiliated. Instead, his movements were precise, methodical, almost military in their efficiency. He picked up each quarter, counted them silently, and placed them in his pocket. He retrieved his boarding pass, checked it for damage, and smoothed it flat before sliding it into his jacket. Airport security guard Evelyn Reyes watched from her position near the metal detectors. She'd worked at Sky Harbor for 11 years, long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it. The Henshaw boy was familiar. His father, Gregory Henshaw, owned 3 luxury car dealerships across Arizona and served on the airport's business advisory board. Young Bradford had a reputation for causing scenes, but complaints mysteriously disappeared before reaching formal channels. "I'm sorry," Tobias said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that didn't match his age. His accent was polished, educated, with barely a hint of the South where he'd been raised by his grandmother for the past 6 months. "Sorry." Bradford stepped closer, invading the younger boy's space. "Sorry doesn't cut it when you bump into people who actually matter. You see this jacket?" He tapped the embroidered crest on his chest. "Pinnacle Academy. You know what it costs to go there? $75,000 a year. That's probably more than your whole family makes." Tobias's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. His grandmother had taught him better than to engage with people like this. More importantly, his father had taught him something else entirely. About patience. About documentation. About letting arrogant people hang themselves with their own rope. Bradford's friend, a lanky kid with perfectly styled blonde hair, named Trevor Ashworth, snickered behind him. "Dude, look at his shoes. Are those from Walmart?" "Probably donated," the third boy, Sebastian Knox, added. His family owned a chain of upscale restaurants across the Southwest. "My mom does charity work. We give stuff to kids like him all the time." The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse. A few travelers threw sympathetic glances at Tobias, but no one intervened. This was the unspoken rule of public spaces. Don't get involved in other people's problems. Don't complicate your own journey. But Evelyn Reyes felt something twist in her stomach. She'd seen this pattern too many times. Rich kids tormenting others while the world looked away because of who their parents were. She started walking toward the group, her hand instinctively moving to the radio on her belt. "You know what your problem is?" Bradford continued, now playing to his friends' cameras. "People like you think you can just go anywhere now. Think you belong in places like this." He gestured around the terminal with its gleaming shops and expensive restaurants. "But there's a natural order to things. Some people fly first class. Some people," he looked Tobias up and down with exaggerated disdain, "well, some people are lucky if they fly at all." That's when Tobias did something completely unexpected. Instead of defending himself or walking away, he pulled out his phone. Not to call for help. Not to record Bradford, which would have been the obvious move. Instead, he opened his messages and typed something quickly, his thumbs moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up with technology. The message was simple: "Dad. Terminal 3, Gate C-17. The Henshaw situation you predicted. It's happening exactly like you said it would." He hit send, then calmly slid the phone into his pocket. His movements were precise, calculated, far too mature for a child who had just been assaulted. His expression hadn't changed. If anything, he looked slightly sad, as if he pitied Bradford rather than feared him. "What are you doing?" Bradford demanded, suspicious now. "Who are you texting?" "Your social worker." "My father," Tobias replied simply. "He's landing soon. He'll want to know I'm at the right gate." Sebastian laughed. "Sure he is. Let me guess, he's flying private? Maybe he's a pilot." "Something like that," Tobias said, and there was something in his tone that should have sent warning bells through Bradford's privileged skull. But teenage arrogance is a powerful anesthetic to common sense. Bradford snatched at Tobias's boarding pass, grabbing it before the younger boy could stop him. He held it up, examining it with theatrical disgust. "Economy class. Seat 32B. Middle seat." He showed it to his friends like evidence in a trial. "Of course. The worst seat on the plane. My grandmother bought that ticket," Tobias said quietly. "She saved for 3 months to send me home for my father's birthday. Every dollar mattered to her." For just a moment, something flickered across Bradford's face. Not quite guilt, but perhaps a shadow of recognition that he'd crossed a line. But Trevor and Sebastian were laughing, and the phones were still recording, and in Bradford's world, backing down was worse than being cruel. "How touching," Bradford sneered, crumpling the boarding pass in his fist. "A sob story about Grandma. You know what? I don't think you deserve to fly today. Maybe you should take the bus instead. It's more your speed." He threw the crumpled paper at Tobias's face and turned to high-five Trevor. That's when Evelyn Reyes finally reached them. "That's enough," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd dealt with thousands of confrontations. "You need to move along, son. Now." Bradford turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Is there a problem, officer? My friends and I were just having a conversation. I saw you push this young man. I saw you destroy his boarding pass. That's assault and destruction of property." Evelyn's hand was definitely on her radio now. "I can have TSA here in 30 seconds. "Really?" Bradford's confidence didn't waver. He pulled out his own phone and dialed a number. "Hey, Dad. Yeah, I'm at the airport. There's a security guard here who seems confused about who's allowed to do what in Terminal 3. Can you call whoever you need to call?" Evelyn felt her stomach drop. She'd been through this before. One call from Gregory Henshaw to his friends on the airport board, and she'd be written up for harassment of passengers. Maybe suspended. She had 2 kids in college and a mortgage. She couldn't afford to lose this job. But as she looked at Tobias, calmly smoothing out his crumpled boarding pass, something made her stand her ground. "I don't care who your father is. You assaulted another passenger. That's not negotiable." Bradford was about to respond when the terminal's atmosphere suddenly changed. It was subtle at first. The way conversations near the windows overlooking the tarmac dropped to whispers. The way people started pointing outside. The way even the perpetual airport announcements seemed to pause. A Gulfstream G650ER was taxiing toward the private aviation terminal, visible through the massive windows. But this wasn't just any private jet. The aircraft was finished in midnight blue with silver accents, and even from a distance, its customization was evident. This was the kind of plane that cost $75 million. The kind that appeared in magazines about the ultra-wealthy. The kind that made even first-class passengers feel poor. "Whoa," Trevor breathed, his phone now pointed at the aircraft instead of Tobias. "That's one of the most expensive private jets in existence. I wonder who's on that." Bradford barely glanced at it, still focused on his confrontation. Probably some tech billionaire. Or maybe a celebrity. Either way, not your problem. He turned back to Tobias. "Now, where were we?" "Oh, right. You were about to apologize properly for." "That's my father's plane," Tobias said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Bradford blinked. "What did you just say?" "That Gulfstream. The blue one. That's my father's plane." Tobias checked his phone. Flight time from New York was 4 hours and 37 minutes. "He's right on schedule." Sebastian laughed, but it sounded forced now. "Dude, stop playing. That jet costs more than most houses." 76 million, actually, Tobias corrected. 76.3 if you include the custom interior modifications. "My father had it designed specifically for transcontinental flights. Maximum range of 7,500 nautical miles. Cruising speed of Mach 0.925. The specificity of the details made Bradford hesitate. Most kids making up stories wouldn't know those numbers. Wouldn't throw them out so casually, like they were discussing the weather. You're lying, Bradford said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. If your dad has that kind of money, why are you flying economy? Because my grandmother bought my ticket before I told my father I was coming home, Tobias explained patiently, as if talking to a small child. She insisted on paying. She's proud like that. Independent. My father respects that about her. He says character matters more than convenience. The Gulfstream had stopped now, positioned in front of the private terminal building. The aircraft door was opening, stairs extending down to the tarmac. Even from this distance, they could see movement inside. Bradford's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. His father. Dad, I told you I'd handle. But Gregory Henshaw's voice was loud enough that even Tobias could hear snippets. Bradford, where exactly are you right now? Terminal 3? Gate C-17? Listen to me very carefully. You need to apologize to whoever you were talking to and leave. Right now. Dad, it's just some. Bradford. The panic in Gregory's voice was palpable. I just got a call from James Rothwell. Do you know who that is? He's the CEO of Rothwell Aviation Holdings. He owns the private terminal. He just informed me that Dominic Vale's plane just landed, and someone at Gate C-17 apparently had an altercation with his son. The name hit Bradford like a physical blow. Dominic Vale. Everyone knew that name. Even sheltered private school kids who thought their parents' millions made them untouchable knew that name. Dominic Vale wasn't just wealthy. He was in an entirely different category of power. The kind of person who appeared in Forbes not for having money, but for making entire industries reshape themselves around his decisions. Bradford's face went pale. He looked at Tobias, really looked at him for the first time. The calm demeanor, the precise way he spoke, the complete lack of fear, the expensive phone that Bradford had barely registered, the subtle details that screamed old money despite the modest clothes. No, Bradford whispered. You're not. Tobias Vale, the boy confirmed, and for the first time, there was something sharp in his voice. Dominic Vale's son, the one you just pushed, the one whose boarding pass you destroyed, the one you told didn't belong in this airport. Trevor and Sebastian had already started backing away, their survival instincts finally kicking in. But Bradford stood frozen, watching through the windows as a tall figure in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit emerged from the Gulfstream. Even from this distance, Dominic Vale's presence was magnetic. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no, never having been made to wait, never having questioned his place in any room he entered. And he was walking toward Terminal 3. Evelyn Reyes pulled out her radio, but her hands were shaking slightly. She'd heard stories about Dominic Vale. Everyone had. The venture capitalist who'd built an empire from nothing. The man who'd transformed 3 struggling airlines into the most profitable carriers in the industry. The investor whose endorsement could make a startup into a unicorn overnight, and whose disapproval could end careers. But the stories also mentioned something else. Something darker. Dominic Vale protected his family with the intensity of someone who'd clawed his way up from poverty and refused to let anyone ever make his children feel the way he once had. There were rumors about executives who'd made inappropriate comments about his wife at a charity gala and found their companies systematically dismantled over the following year. Whispers about a private school principal who disciplined Tobias unfairly and ended up unemployed and unhireable in education within a month. Bradford's phone rang again. His father's voice was pure panic now. Bradford, listen to me. Dominic Vale is worth $7.8 billion. He sits on the board of 12 Fortune 500 companies. He has dinner with senators. He's personal friends with the governor. And you just assaulted his son. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem. You never know because you never think. Do you understand what this could do to our family? Our business? Vale Aviation Capital owns the financing on 2 of my dealerships. If he decides to call those loans, we're finished. If he makes one phone call to any of my lenders, we're finished. If he simply tells people not to do business with the Henshaw family, we're finished. Bradford looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. But he was trapped. Terminal gates were designed to control flow. There was only one way in and out, and Dominic Vale was coming from that direction. Tobias had retrieved his crumpled boarding pass and was carefully smoothing it against his leg. He pulled out a small kit from his backpack, the kind of meticulous organizational tool that spoke of careful upbringing, and placed the damaged document inside a protective sleeve. You documented everything, didn't you? Bradford asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tobias looked up at him with those steady dark eyes. Every word, every push, every insult. Video, audio, timestamps, witness statements. He gestured to the crowd that had gathered, many still holding their phones. You made it easy, actually. You wanted an audience. Why? Bradford's voice cracked. Why would you let me keep going if you knew? Because my father told me something once, Tobias interrupted. He said that people reveal who they really are when they think there are no consequences. He said that true character shows when you have power over someone weaker. And he said that the most important lesson anyone can learn is that actions have consequences, no matter who your parents are. Through the terminal windows, Dominic Vale had reached the building. He was flanked by two men in dark suits, clearly security, and a woman in business attire carrying a tablet. But Vale's attention was focused entirely on finding his son. Evelyn Reyes made a decision. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Tobias. Whatever was about to happen, she would at least try to do her job correctly. Bradford's knees actually buckled slightly. He grabbed the check-in counter for support. Please, he said, and now there were tears in his eyes. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. You meant every word, Tobias said, not cruelly, just factually. You meant it when you pushed me. You meant it when you mocked my grandmother's sacrifice. You meant it when you told me people like me don't belong in places like this. You meant all of it. The only thing you regret is who I turned out to be. The terminal doors slid open. Dominic Vale entered Terminal 3 with the kind of presence that made conversations stop. He was 6 feet 4 inches, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single glance. His suit was Brioni, probably $15,000. His watch was a Patek Philippe Nautilus, easily 6 figures. But it was his expression that made Bradford's blood run cold. This wasn't the face of anger. Anger was hot, impulsive, potentially negotiable. This was something colder. This was the face of a man who'd built an empire by carefully calculating the cost of every decision and the price of every slight. This was the face of someone who'd grown up in the kind of poverty that Bradford couldn't imagine, who'd been looked down on by people exactly like the Henshaws, and who'd spent 30 years ensuring that no one would ever dare to treat his family that way. Dominic's eyes found Tobias immediately. The cold calculation vanished, replaced by pure paternal concern. Tobias, he said, his voice carrying across the terminal. Are you hurt? I'm fine, Dad, Tobias replied, walking toward his father. Just a misunderstanding. But Dominic's eyes had already moved to Bradford, to the Letterman jacket, to the expensive sneakers, to the phone still clutched in his trembling hand. Then to Evelyn Reyes, whose uniform and stance told him she was the authority who tried to intervene. Finally, his gaze swept across the crowd of witnesses, many still recording. A misunderstanding, Dominic repeated, his voice neutral. He knelt down to Tobias's level, his hands gentle as he checked his son's shoulder where it had hit the counter. Tell me about this misunderstanding. Dad, we can talk about it at home. No, there was steel in that single word. We'll talk about it right here, right now. Because if someone put their hands on you, that's not a misunderstanding. That's assault. And if someone made you feel unwelcome in a public space because of how you look or where you come from, that's not a misunderstanding either. That's something else entirely. Dominic stood up, his full height suddenly seeming to fill the entire terminal. He looked at Bradford, and the younger boy actually whimpered. What's your name, son? Dominic asked, his voice polite, almost gentle. That made it worse somehow. B. Bradford Henshaw, sir. Henshaw, Dominic repeated, as if tasting the word. Gregory Henshaw's boy? The dealerships? Bradford nodded, unable to speak. I see. Dominic pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate. He dialed a number, never taking his eyes off Bradford. James, it's Dominic Vale. Yes, I just landed. Listen, I need you to pull the security footage from Terminal 3, Gate C-17, for the last 30 minutes. Every angle you have. I need it sent to my legal team within the hour. Also, put me in touch with whoever handles assault cases for the airport police. My son was attacked by another passenger. Wait. Bradford's voice cracked. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Dominic held up a hand for silence. He was still on the phone. Also, James, can you tell me if Gregory Henshaw still has financing arrangements with any Vale Aviation Capital subsidiaries? He does? Good. I'll want a full review of those agreements. Today. He hung up and finally addressed Bradford directly. You put your hands on my 13-year-old son. You destroyed his property. You humiliated him in public. And from what these witnesses seem to have recorded, you did it because you thought he was beneath you. Do I have that right?" Bradford was crying openly now. "I didn't know who he was. And that," Dominic said softly, "is exactly the problem." He turned to Evelyn Reyes. "Officer, I saw you trying to intervene. What happened when you did?" Evelyn straightened, sensing this was important. "He called his father, sir. Threatened my job because his dad sits on the airport advisory board." Dominic's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Did he now?" He pulled out his phone again. "Get me Governor Reeves." "Yes, I'll hold." Bradford's face went from pale to gray. Trevor and Sebastian had completely disappeared into the crowd. Gregory Henshaw was nowhere to be seen, probably already in a conference room somewhere trying to do damage control with his lawyers. The crowd of witnesses had swelled. Everyone wanted to see what happened when real power confronted privileged arrogance. Phones were everywhere now, recording every second. This would be on social media within minutes. News sites within hours. Tobias stood next to his father, watching Bradford with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite satisfaction either. He'd known this was coming. His father had warned him that people like Bradford existed everywhere, and that the only way to deal with them was to let them expose themselves completely before stepping into the light. "Governor Reeves," Dominic said into his phone. "Dominic Vale. I'm fine, thank you. Listen, I'm at Sky Harbor right now, and I've just learned something troubling about your airport advisory board. One of the members, Gregory Henshaw, apparently uses his position to protect his son from consequences when that son assaults other passengers." "Yes," I said, "assault. No, not just any passenger. Mine." There was a pause. Even through the phone, they could hear the governor's tone change. "Yes, that's what I thought," Dominic continued. "I'm going to be sending you and the airport authority a full documentation package within the next few hours. Video, witness statements, the works. I trust you'll handle this appropriately. I'd hate to have to take this public, but I will if I need to. No one puts their hands on my son and walks away thinking their family name protects them." He hung up and looked at Bradford again. The boy had collapsed against the check-in counter, completely broken. "Mr. Henshaw," Dominic said, and his voice was almost kind now, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This isn't even really about you, though you're certainly going to face consequences. This is about a lesson that someone clearly failed to teach you." He gestured around the terminal at the diverse crowd of travelers. "Every single person in this airport has value. Every single person deserves respect. The janitor cleaning the bathroom, the security guard doing her job, the grandmother who saved for 3 months to buy her grandson a plane ticket. They all matter. And money, family connections, fancy schools, none of that gives you the right to treat them otherwise." Bradford tried to speak, but nothing came out. "Your father is probably ruined," Dominic continued matter-of-factly. "I'll make sure of that. Not because I'm cruel, but because he raised a son who thinks assault is acceptable and that family connections are shields against consequences. That suggests a fundamental failure of character that I don't want anywhere near my business interests." He turned to Tobias. "Come on, son. Let's get you home. We have a birthday to celebrate." But as they started to walk away, Dominic paused. He looked back at Bradford one final time. "You asked my son why he was flying economy class if his family has money. The answer is simple. Because his grandmother wanted to give him that gift, and he valued her love more than his comfort. That's called character, Mr. Henshaw. And no amount of money can buy it if you don't already have it." As father and son walked toward the private terminal exit, Bradford Henshaw remained collapsed against the check-in counter, surrounded by witnesses who'd seen everything, recorded everything, documented everything. The last thing he heard before the terminal doors closed was Tobias's quiet voice asking his father a question that would haunt Bradford for the rest of his life. "Dad, do you think he'll learn from this? Do you think people like him can actually change?" And Dominic Vale's response, just barely audible, "I don't know, son. But he's about to find out what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness and patience for powerlessness. And that's a lesson worth." The doors closed, cutting off the rest of the sentence. But inside the private terminal's executive lounge, Dominic Vale finished his thought as he and Tobias walked down the marble corridor toward the car waiting outside. A lesson worth learning, even if it costs everything you thought made you important. Tobias was quiet for a moment, his small hand gripping the handle of his backpack. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see Bradford still slumped against the counter in the public terminal, surrounded by security personnel who had finally arrived. Evelyn Reyes was speaking with them, gesturing, clearly giving her account. "Dad," Tobias said softly. "What's going to happen to him?" Dominic stopped walking. He turned to face his son, kneeling down so they were eye level. This was important. This was the moment that would define whether his son learned about power or about justice. "What do you think should happen to him?" Dominic asked. Tobias considered this carefully. He was 13, but he'd learned early that words had weight. Actions had consequences, and justice wasn't always the same as revenge. "I think," Tobias began slowly, "he should understand what he did. Really understand it. Not just be scared because you're powerful, but actually see why it was wrong." Dominic smiled, and there was genuine pride in his eyes. "Tell me more." "When he pushed me, when he said those things, it wasn't really about me. He didn't know me. He saw someone he thought was weak, someone without protection, and he decided that made it okay to hurt them." Tobias's voice was steady, mature. "But people like that, they've been doing it their whole lives. To servers in restaurants. To people who work for their parents. To anyone they think can't fight back. And," Dominic prompted, "and I think the only way he learns is if he becomes that person. If he understands what it feels like when the whole world decides you don't matter." Dominic stood up slowly. "You know what I was going to do when I walked into that terminal?" Tobias shook his head. "I was going to destroy everything. His father's business. Their family reputation. I was going to make sure that every door that ever opened for the Henshaws slammed shut permanently." Dominic's voice was matter of fact. "I've done it before. To people who threatened my family. To companies that tried to cheat my partners. I know exactly how to dismantle a life, piece by piece." He paused, watching his son's reaction. "But then I heard you say something to that boy. Something about whether he could change. And I realized you were asking a more important question than whether I could punish him." Dominic placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder. "You were asking whether punishment serves justice or just our own anger." Through the window, they watched as Bradford was being led away by airport security. His father had arrived, Gregory Henshaw looking 10 years older than he had that morning, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like a costume rather than armor. "So what are we going to do?" Tobias asked. Dominic pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts and made a call. "Marcus, it's Dominic. I need you to set up something for me." "No, not legal action. Something different. I want a meeting scheduled with Gregory Henshaw and his son. At my office. Monday morning." "No, not to threaten them. To offer them something. You'll see." He hung up and looked at his son. "We're going to give them a choice. A real one." Monday morning arrived with the weight of Judgment Day for the Henshaw family. Gregory Henshaw's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie in the reflection of the glass doors leading to Vale Tower, the 40-story monument to Dominic Vale's empire in downtown Phoenix. Bradford stood beside him, his Letterman jacket replaced by a somber navy blazer, his eyes rimmed with dark circles from 3 sleepless nights. The weekend had been hell. Videos of the airport incident had gone viral. Bradford's face was everywhere, plastered across social media with hashtags like #privilegedbully and #airportkarma. Pinnacle Academy had called. The football team had called. Even Trevor and Sebastian's parents had called, making it clear their sons were no longer permitted to associate with Bradford. But worse than the public humiliation was the waiting. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for Dominic Vale to call in the loans on the dealerships. Waiting for lawsuits. Waiting for complete destruction. The elevator ride to the 40th floor was silent except for the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Gregory kept glancing at his son, seeing not just the arrogant teenager who'd assaulted another child, but the little boy he'd apparently failed to raise properly. Where had it all gone wrong? When had teaching Bradford that he was special become teaching him that others weren't? The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that screamed quiet power. Everything was understated, expensive, permanent. A young woman at the desk smiled politely. "Mr. Henshaw? Mr. Vale is expecting you. Please, follow me." They were led through corridors lined with photographs. Not the typical corporate vanity shots, but something different. Pictures of schools in developing countries. Community centers. Scholarship recipients at graduation. One particular photograph caught Bradford's eye. A young black boy, maybe 9 years old, standing in front of a dilapidated apartment building. wearing clothes that were clean but clearly worn. The caption read, Dominic Vale, age 9, East Baltimore. Bradford stopped, staring at the photograph. The boy in the picture had the same steady eyes as the man who'd walked into the airport terminal. The same quiet dignity that Tobias had shown even while being humiliated. Mr. Henshaw? The receptionist was waiting. They entered a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Phoenix. But Bradford barely noticed the vista. He was focused on Dominic Vale, who stood from behind his desk with the same measured calm he'd shown at the airport. Tobias sat in a chair to the side, looking small in the massive office, but somehow still possessing that same unshakable composure. Thank you for coming, Dominic said, gesturing to 2 chairs across from his desk. His voice was neutral, businesslike. Please sit. Gregory Henshaw cleared his throat. Mr. Vale, I want to start by saying. Dominic held up a hand. Before we begin, I want you both to watch something. He turned on a large screen mounted on the wall. The airport security footage began to play. But this wasn't just the incident with Bradford and Tobias. This was a compilation. Bradford pushing Tobias. Bradford mocking a janitor outside the terminal. Bradford laughing at an elderly woman struggling with her luggage. Bradford cutting in front of a family at the coffee shop. All from the same afternoon. All within 90 minutes. Bradford felt sick watching himself. Each casual cruelty, each dismissive gesture, each moment of thoughtless arrogance played out in high definition. This was who he was when he thought no one important was watching. The screen went black. That young man you pushed is my son, Dominic began, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge now. But he's not the only person you hurt that day. He's just the only one whose father had the power to make you face consequences. Gregory started to speak, but Dominic continued. I grew up in East Baltimore, in a neighborhood where violence was currency and poverty was inherited like genetic disease. My mother cleaned houses for families like yours, families who treated her like furniture, who made her use separate bathrooms, who paid her in cash so they wouldn't have to report it on their taxes. He stood up, walking to the windows. When I was Tobias's age, I was beaten up by a group of older kids at a bus stop. They took the $37 I'd saved from mowing lawns. When I tried to report it, do you know what the police officer said? He said boys like me needed to learn to handle our own problems, that the system wasn't designed to protect people like us. Bradford felt tears burning his eyes, but he couldn't look away. I built this empire from nothing, Dominic continued, turning back to face them. And I promised myself that when I had power, I would use it to make sure no child ever felt the way I felt that day. Invisible, worthless, beneath protection. He walked back to his desk and sat down. So when my son texted me that he was being assaulted by someone who thought their family name made them untouchable, every instinct I have screamed to destroy you. Both of you. To make you understand powerlessness at a cellular level. Gregory Henshaw's face had gone completely white. Bradford was openly crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. But then Tobias asked me a question, Dominic said, his voice softening slightly. He asked if people like you could change. And I realized that I had a choice. I could teach you about revenge, or I could teach you about redemption. The first one is easier, but the second one might actually matter. He pressed a button on his desk. The screen lit up again, but this time it showed a different kind of documentation. Scholarship programs, community centers, youth mentorship initiatives, all funded by Vale Foundation. This is what power looks like when it's used correctly, Dominic said. Not to elevate yourself, but to lift others. Not to punish, but to transform. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. Gregory reached for it with shaking hands, opening it to find documents, contracts, detailed proposals. Here's what's going to happen, Dominic said, his voice taking on the tone of someone laying out non-negotiable terms. First, Bradford will be enrolled in a program I've designed specifically for young people who've abused their privilege. It's a 6-month intensive. You'll work at 3 different jobs. Custodial services at a public school, food service at a homeless shelter, and orderly work at a community hospital. Bradford's head snapped up. What? You'll work 40 hours a week. Minimum wage. You'll live on exactly what you earn, no supplemental allowances from your family. You'll use public transportation. You'll shop at discount grocery stores. You'll understand what it means to survive rather than thrive. Gregory started to protest, but Dominic's expression silenced him. Second, Every Friday evening, you'll attend a workshop on empathy, privilege, and social responsibility. These workshops are led by people who've experienced the kind of treatment you dished out. Formerly incarcerated individuals, immigrants, service workers, people who've been made invisible by society. You'll listen to their stories. You'll document their experiences. And you'll write reflections on what you've learned. Dominic turned to Gregory. As for you, every penny of profit from your dealerships for the next 12 months will be donated to educational programs for underprivileged youth. Not as a tax write-off, as genuine restitution for raising a son who believed money made him superior to others. Gregory's face went even paler. That's everything. That's our entire income. No, Dominic corrected. That's your excess. You'll still receive salaries that will keep you comfortable, but you'll learn the difference between necessity and luxury, between surviving and showing off. He pulled out another document. Vail Aviation Capital will extend your loan terms, but at a cost. You'll establish a program at your dealerships that provides employment opportunities and transportation assistance to individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. Real opportunities, not token positions. With advancement potential. With dignity. Bradford was staring at the documents, his mind racing. 6 months of his life. Working jobs he'd looked down on his entire existence. Living like the people he'd mocked. And if we refuse? Gregory asked quietly. Dominic's expression didn't change. Then I exercise every bit of power I have. The loans get called. The advisory board position disappears. Every business relationship you've built gets systematically dismantled. And the videos of your son assaulting mine get sent to every college he's applied to, every scholarship committee, every future employer who ever searches his name. The silence in the room was absolute. But that's not what I want, Dominic continued, and now his voice held something different. Not quite warmth, but something approaching hope. What I want is for Bradford to stand in that airport terminal 10 years from now and see a child being bullied and step in to stop it. Not because he's afraid of consequences, but because he genuinely understands why it's wrong. He looked directly at Bradford. I want you to lie awake at night 10 years from now and remember every person you've hurt and feel genuine remorse. Not shame that you got caught, but actual understanding of the pain you caused. That's worth more to me than destroying your father's business. Tobias spoke for the first time since they'd entered the office. Bradford, do you remember what you said about my shoes? That they looked like they came from Walmart. Bradford nodded miserably. My grandmother bought me those shoes, Tobias said quietly. She worked 2 jobs after my mother died 3 years ago. She raised me while my father traveled for business. Those shoes cost her $43.76, and she saved for 2 months to afford them. She wrapped them in newspaper because she couldn't afford gift wrap, and she cried when she gave them to me because she wished she could afford better. Bradford's shoulders began to shake with sobs. But they're the most valuable shoes I've ever owned, Tobias continued. Not because of what they cost, but because of what they represent. Someone who loves me enough to sacrifice. Someone who values character over appearance. Someone who taught me that dignity isn't about what you wear, it's about how you treat others. He stood up and walked closer to Bradford. You can't undo what you did to me, but you can make sure you never do it to anyone else. That's what my dad is offering you. Not punishment. Education. The kind of education that Pinnacle Academy apparently failed to provide despite costing $75,000 a year. Dominic stood as well. You have 24 hours to decide. Take the program, do the work, genuinely try to become better people, or refuse and face the consequences of unchecked privilege meeting accountability. He walked to the door and opened it. The choice is yours. But understand this. If you take the program and I discover you're just performing, just going through the motions without genuine change, the consequences will be worse than if you'd refused from the start. I have no tolerance for fraudulent redemption. Gregory and Bradford left Vail Tower in silence. They drove home in silence. They sat in their living room, in a house that suddenly felt too big, too expensive, too much like a monument to values neither of them could articulate. Dad, Bradford finally said, his voice hoarse. I think we should do it. Gregory looked at his son, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in years. It's going to be hard. Harder than anything you've ever done. I know. Bradford wiped his eyes. But I watch myself on that screen. I saw who I've become. And I'm terrified that if we don't do this, that's who I'll always be. That night, Bradford lay in his bed, staring at his Letterman jacket hanging in the closet. The jacket that had represented everything he thought mattered. Achievement. Status. Belonging to something exclusive. Tomorrow, he would donate it. Because he was about to learn what it meant to belong to something more important. Humanity. 6 months later, Terminal 3 at Sky Harbor International Airport looked the same. Same marble floors. Same crowds. Same perpetual announcements echoing through the space. But the young man mopping those floors at 5 a.m. before the morning rush was different. Bradford Henshaw wore a custodial uniform with his name embroidered on the chest. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused from work. His Balenciaga sneakers had been replaced by practical work boots. His hair, once perfectly styled, was pulled back under a cap. He was cleaning up a spill near gate C-17 when he saw them. A group of teenagers, private school kids based on their uniforms, surrounding a younger girl. She was crying, clutching her backpack, while they laughed and filmed her distress. 6 months ago, Bradford would have walked past. Or worse, joined in. But the person he was now couldn't do that. The weeks of listening to stories from people he'd once dismissed. The elderly homeless man who'd served in Vietnam. The immigrant woman who'd fled violence. The janitor who worked 3 jobs to support his family. Each story had chipped away at the armor of privilege until all that remained was raw understanding. Bradford set down his mop. He walked toward the group, his heart pounding. This was different from his old confrontations. This time, he was the one with less power. Less status. Less protection. "Hey," he said, his voice steady. "Leave her alone." The kids turned to look at him. One of them, a tall boy with expensive headphones, sneered. "Who are you, the janitor? Mind your business." "This is my business," Bradford replied. "I work here. And what you're doing isn't okay." "What are you going to do about it?" another kid challenged. Bradford pulled out his phone and held it up, recording. "I'm going to document this. And then I'm going to report it to security, to your school, to your parents. And if you think your family name will protect you, you're wrong." I learned that the hard way. Something in his tone made them hesitate. This wasn't the confidence of privilege. This was the quiet authority of someone who'd learned genuine lessons about consequences. The kids dispersed, muttering insults, but moving away. The girl looked up at Bradford with tearful gratitude. "Thank you." Bradford knelt down to her level, remembering how Dominic Vale had done the same with Tobias. "Are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" She nodded. "My mom. She's picking me up at gate B-12. "Let me walk you there," Bradford said. "And if those kids ever bother you again, you find me. I'm here every morning, 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. My name is Bradford. I'm on your side." As he walked the girl to her gate, returned to his mop, and continued cleaning, Bradford felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, but something quieter and deeper. Purpose. That evening, at his weekly reflection workshop, Bradford shared the story. The room was filled with the people he'd learned from over the past 6 months. Maria, the hotel housekeeper who'd immigrated from Guatemala. James, the formerly incarcerated man rebuilding his life. Dr. Patricia Chun, who facilitated the sessions. "How did it feel?" Dr. Chun asked. Bradford thought carefully. "It felt like being on the right side of something for the first time in my life. Like I was using whatever privilege I have left to protect instead of harm." Maria smiled. "That's growth, Mijo. Real growth." After the session, Bradford found Tobias Vale waiting in the lobby. They'd seen each other occasionally over the months. Awkward encounters that neither quite knew how to navigate. But tonight felt different. "I heard what you did today," Tobias said. "Security guard Reyes told my dad." Bradford felt his stomach drop. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Tobias said. And for the first time since the airport, he smiled at Bradford. "You're doing exactly what the program is designed to do. You stepped in when someone needed help." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Bradford finally said. "What I did to you, what I said, I can't take it back. But I want you to know that I think about it every day. And I'm trying to be someone different. Someone better." Tobias considered this. "My dad told me something once. He said the measure of a person isn't their worst moment. It's what they do after that moment. Whether they make excuses or make changes." He held out his hand. "You're making changes, Bradford. That matters." Bradford shook his hand, tears streaming down his face. This simple gesture of acknowledgement felt more valuable than any trophy, any award, any privilege he'd ever taken for granted. 1 year after the airport incident, Dominic Vail stood at a podium at the Phoenix Convention Center. The annual Business Ethics Summit had drawn leaders from across the country, and Vail was the keynote speaker. But sitting in the front row were two unexpected guests, Gregory and Bradford Henshaw. "We talk about accountability in business," Dominic began, his voice carrying through the massive hall. "We discuss ethics, corporate responsibility, stakeholder value. But we rarely talk about the most fundamental question: what do we owe each other simply because we share humanity?" He clicked to a slide showing that photograph from his office. 9-year-old Dominic in East Baltimore. "I grew up believing that power was about domination, about getting yours before someone took it, about climbing over others to reach the top. And for a long time, I operated that way. Ruthlessly, efficiently, successfully." Another slide. Tobias at the airport, picking up his scattered quarters. "Then I became a father, and everything changed. Not immediately, not all at once. But gradually, I realized that the empire I was building would be worthless if I raised a son who believed that wealth made him superior to others. That success gave him license to be cruel." He looked directly at Bradford. "A year ago, my son was assaulted at an airport by a young man who believed his family name made him untouchable. My first instinct was to destroy that young man and his family. And I had the power to do it." The audience was silent, riveted. But my son asked me a question that changed everything. He asked if people could change. And I realized that I had a choice between being powerful and being transformative, between punishment and education, between revenge and redemption. He gestured to Bradford. "That young man is here today. Bradford Henshaw, please stand." Bradford stood, his face flushing as hundreds of eyes turned to him. Bradford spent the last year working minimum wage jobs, learning what it means to survive rather than thrive, listening to stories from people he'd been taught to dismiss, and slowly, painfully, genuinely changing who he is at a fundamental level. Dominic smiled. Next fall, Bradford will be attending community college on a scholarship from the Vail Foundation. Not because his family couldn't afford university, but because he chose to prove that education and character aren't about the price tag of the institution. They're about the willingness to learn, to grow, to become someone worthy of the opportunities you've been given. The applause was thunderous. Bradford sat down, overwhelmed, as people around him shook his hand and patted his shoulder. After the speech, Gregory approached Dominic. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Dominic replied. "Thank your son for having the courage to change. That's rarer than you think. Most people defend their worst selves rather than transform them." He looked at Bradford, who was talking earnestly with a group of community college students. "He's going to do something important with his life. I can see it. The question is whether he'll use this experience to help others or to rebuild the same walls of privilege he learned to climb." "I think I know which one he'll choose," Gregory said quietly. 5 years later, Bradford Henshaw stood in Terminal 3 of Sky Harbor International Airport. But he wasn't mopping floors or avoiding eye contact. He was filming a documentary. His film, The Price of Privilege: How Accountability Transformed My Life, had been accepted to Sundance. It told the story of his journey from entitled bully to advocate for social justice. It featured interviews with Maria, James, Dr. Chun, and most importantly, with Tobias Vail. In the documentary's most powerful scene, Bradford and Tobias stood at Gate C-17, on the exact spot where everything had changed. "What do you want people to take away from this story?" Tobias asked, his voice now deeper, more mature at 18. Bradford looked directly into the camera. "I want them to understand that privilege isn't just about money. It's about the 1,000 small ways we're taught that some people matter more than others. The way we treat service workers. The way we talk about people who look different or come from different circumstances. The casual cruelties we commit because we've never been taught to see certain people as fully human." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "I was that person. I looked at Tobias and saw someone I could hurt without consequences. And I was almost right. If his father had been anyone else, I would have walked away feeling powerful, feeling superior. And I would have kept hurting people until someone finally stopped me. But someone did stop you," Tobias said. "Your father gave me something more valuable than punishment," Bradford replied. "He gave me the chance to become someone different, someone better. And that gift, that mercy wrapped in accountability, changed everything." The documentary ended with footage from the Ethics Summit, from Bradford's graduation from community college, from his acceptance to law school, where he planned to specialize in civil rights. And finally, a scene of Bradford volunteering at a youth center, teaching teenage boys about respect, empathy, and the weight of privilege. On the night of the documentary's premiere, the theater was packed. Dominic and Tobias Vale sat next to Gregory and Bradford Henshaw, no longer adversaries, but something more complex. Not quite friends, but connected by the shared understanding that the worst moments in our lives can become the foundation for our best selves. As the credits rolled and the audience stood to applaud, Bradford felt Tobias's hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," Tobias said simply. "For what?" Bradford asked, confused. "You're the one I hurt." "For proving my dad right," Tobias replied. "For showing that people can change. For giving me hope that the next time I see someone being cruel, there's a chance they might become someone who stops cruelty instead of perpetuating it." Bradford smiled, tears in his eyes. "Your father saved my life, you know. Not my physical life, but my soul. He saw something worth saving when everyone else, including me, only saw someone worth destroying." In the lobby after the premiere, a young woman approached Bradford nervously. "Mr. Henshaw? I was the girl you helped at the airport. The one being bullied. I just wanted to say that what you did that morning, it mattered. It made me believe that people could be good, that someone would step in." She handed him an envelope. "I wrote you a letter. About how that moment changed my life. About how I stopped being afraid. I thought you should know that your redemption didn't just transform you. It rippled outward." As Bradford read the letter later that night, sitting in his modest apartment decorated with photographs from his years of service work, he understood something profound. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a practice. Every day, he had to choose to be the person Dominic Vale had believed he could become. Every day, he had to remember the boy who'd been pushed against an airport counter and decide to be someone who protected rather than harmed. His phone buzzed. A text from Tobias. "Proud of you, Bradford. Keep doing the work." Bradford smiled. The work. That's exactly what it was. The lifelong work of earning back your humanity, one choice at a time. One intervention at a time. One moment of standing up for someone else at a time. He looked at the photograph hanging above his desk. Gate C, 17, Sky Harbor International Airport. The place where Bradford Henshaw the bully had died, and Bradford Henshaw the human being had been born. 10 years after that Friday afternoon in Terminal 3, Dominic Vale received an invitation to a wedding. Bradford Henshaw was getting married to Maya Rodriguez, a public defender he'd met while volunteering at a legal aid clinic. The ceremony would be held at a community center in one of Phoenix's most underserved neighborhoods. Dominic showed the invitation to Tobias, now 23 and finishing his MBA. "Are we going?" Tobias asked. "What do you think?" Dominic replied. Tobias smiled. "I think we should. I think Bradford earned that." At the wedding, Bradford's best man was James, the formerly incarcerated man from his reflection workshops. His groomsmen were a mixture of people from every phase of his journey. College friends from community college, law school classmates, young men he'd mentored through the years. When Bradford gave his speech at the reception, he told the story. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. About being cruel, entitled, and destructive. About assaulting a child in an airport. About facing consequences for the first time in his privileged life. "I tell you this," Bradford said, his voice carrying through the room. "Not to center my redemption, but to acknowledge that I was given something most people who hurt others never receive, the chance to change. And that chance came with a cost. It required work, humility, and the willingness to face exactly who I had been." He looked at Dominic and Tobias. "Mr. Vale, you taught me that power isn't about domination. It's about deciding what kind of world you want to create with your influence. You could have destroyed me. Instead, you transformed me. And in doing so, you showed me what it means to be truly powerful." He turned to his new wife. Maya defends people who the system has given up on. She believes that everyone deserves a second chance, but that second chances must be earned. She saw who I was trying to become, not just who I had been. And that belief, that faith in redemption, it's the greatest gift anyone can give. As the reception continued, Dominic and Bradford found themselves alone on the community center's balcony, looking out over the neighborhood. "You did it," Dominic said simply. "You became someone different." Bradford shook his head. "I'm becoming someone different. Every day? It's never finished." Every morning I wake up and choose to remember what you taught me. That everyone matters. That privilege is a responsibility, not a right. That character is defined by how we treat people who can't benefit us. He smiled. I teach high school now, social studies, and every semester, I tell my students about the worst day of my life. The day I pushed a boy in an airport and discovered that I was everything I'd been raised to be, entitled, cruel, blind to my own privilege. And then I tell them about what happened after, about work and workshops and transformation. What do they say? Dominic asked. They ask if I think people should always get second chances, if forgiveness is the same as accountability, if redemption erases harm. Bradford's expression was thoughtful, and I tell them that those are the right questions, that there are no easy answers, but that the alternative, a world where people can never change, where mistakes define us forever, that's not a world worth building. Dominic placed his hand on Bradford's shoulder. Tobias was right to ask if you could change, and you were brave enough to prove the answer was yes. That's worth more than any business I've built or deal I've closed. If you're watching this story and you see yourself in Bradford's cruelty, understand this. Change is possible, but it's not easy. It requires more than apologies. It demands transformation at a fundamental level. It means facing the worst parts of yourself and doing the painful work of becoming someone better. If you see yourself in Tobias's victimization, understand this. Documenting injustice is powerful, but it's just the first step. Real power comes from deciding what you want from those who've harmed you. Revenge? Justice? Or transformation? If you see yourself in Dominic's position, with power to punish, understand this. The choice between destruction and redemption isn't about being soft on wrongdoing. It's about asking what actually serves the greater good. Sometimes consequences mean ending someone's career. Sometimes consequences mean giving them the education they clearly never received. But here's what we all need to understand. Privilege without responsibility is tyranny. Power without compassion is destruction. And wealth without character is just expensive emptiness. Bradford Henshaw learned that lesson the hard way. But he learned it. And in learning it, he became someone who could teach it to others. Someone who could stand in that airport terminal and choose to protect instead of harm. Someone who could transform his greatest shame into his greatest purpose. That's the real power of redemption. Not erasing the past, but using it to build a better future. Not forgetting who we were, but refusing to remain that person. Not seeking forgiveness, but earning the right to be different. If this story moved you, if it made you think about power, privilege, and the possibility of change, then do something with that feeling. Don't just hit the like button and move on. Look at your own life. Where are you the Bradford who dismisses others? Where are you the bystander who pretends not to see? Where are you the Dominic with power to choose between punishment and transformation? Subscribe to this channel, not just for more stories, but as a commitment to being someone who sees these moments and chooses to act differently. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone struggling with their own worst behaviors. Someone who's been victimized and needs to know that standing up changes everything. Someone with power who needs to understand the weight of their choices. And most importantly, the next time you're in an airport, a restaurant, a store, anywhere where you see someone being treated as less than human, remember this story. Remember that how we treat each other when no one important is watching defines who we really are. Be the person who steps in. Be the person who documents injustice. Be the person who offers transformation instead of destruction. Be the person who proves that we can build a world where everyone matters, where privilege comes with responsibility, and where second chances are given to those brave enough to earn them. Because in the end, this isn't just Bradford's story or Tobias's story or Dominic's story. It's our story. The story of what happens when we choose to be better than our worst moments. When we choose to see each other's humanity. When we choose to believe that change, real lasting change, is always possible. That's the lesson worth learning. That's the story worth sharing. That's the world worth building. One choice at a time. One intervention at a time. One transformed life at a time.